Michael is a fellow at HPE, and he's really an expert in-memory computing and working with really large memories and figuring out how that can be dealt with by computing. So I'm going to ask him a little bit about that in a minute. But the other two people are also experts at that. And Maria, as you just saw, she's at CERN, and she runs something called CERN Open Lab, which is an industrial collaboration framework that CERN, which is the European Particle Accelerator, out of which, by the way, the World Wide Web emerged. So important things, even beyond the Higgs boson, have been developed there. Tim Berners-Lee was at CERN when he came up with that idea. But Maria oversees this she's the CTO of this group that works with business and industry to come up with new ways of solving the technical problems that CERN encounters. And we all, by the way, got these stress reduction devices connected to the video. And then finally, Steve, who's our Micron guy here, he is in charge of the work at Micron, and he's not really into titles, clearly, because he said the way I should introduce him is he's overseeing the work on how you combine memory, storage, and compute in general, and that is kind of the theme of this whole conference. So he's doing a pretty important job here at Micron. But I want to start with Michael from HPE, and I really want you to just tell us how you look at this question of scientific discovery, which is sort of the big picture topic of the panel, and what is the relationship of your work over the last couple of decades on large group memory aggregations and how you deal with it, and what's going to be possible with scientific discovery going forward?
Sure. So firstly, I'm glad to get a piece of the universe that's obviously key from CERN. But as you mentioned, I've been working on large memory systems for quite a while now. And the real key to the power of them is getting all of the data in memory. So you can basically look anywhere in this entire address space for information that's going to help unlock your problems. And especially now as we're into this world of just exponentially increasing the amount of data we get from instruments like the LHC and other areas, it's how do we gain insights from this tremendous amount of data. And traditionally we've used scientific equations to help us understand how things are working, but now we move into this era where we have increasing amounts of data from various instruments, experiments, and we can actually use other techniques to gain insight, because traditional computing, traditional CPUs, the gain of performance is slowing down. It hasn't stopped, but it's slowing down just at this point where we get this exponential growth of data. So how do we close that gap? So we were really thinking about re-architecting systems to think memory first. Get all of your data in memory, and then you can operate and ask these questions where you don't quite know where you're going next, because you need the answer for the first question before you go to the next piece of information.
So in other words, if you're asking a series of complex questions and you don't even necessarily know what the questions are going to be until you start the work, having all the data right there where it can be processed without going to hard drives and all kinds of other storage mechanisms that take time will actually allow things to be discovered that could not otherwise be discovered.
Yeah, that's we see that in a number of areas, and it's really as we look to collapse the storage memory hierarchy down, as we're getting ever denser memory technologies, we're getting persistent memory technologies, so we can strip away layers of protocol changes, software APIs, and just let processors go directly to this common address space. So you can run much faster, get rid of a lot of legacy baggage that was really sort of put together to hide the latencies and bandwidth challenges of technologies. Now we have an abundance of memory available, relatively cost effectively. This can help us unlock new insights.
I mean, I have to say, for me, even prepping for this panel, I learned so much, because we hear all about this big data era we're in, right? And the idea sort of is, just the amount of data is going to allow us to do new stuff. But in reality, it requires a completely different architecture to really deal with it properly, which was kind of a revelation for me. So Maria, talk a little more in detail about exactly what some of the challenges are that you're dealing with at CERN. You mentioned some statistics in the video, but you might want to repeat those.
Okay.
What is the scale of the data challenge you're facing?
So the scale is, I would say, enormous. Protons collide with other protons at an incredible rate of 40 million times a second.
Wow.
And we are keeping the events that we believe have some interest to be further studied, and we keep 1,000 events a second. So
of the 40 million, you're only really looking at 1,000.
Yeah.
But you got to figure out which 1,000.
Exactly.
Right.
So every second we need to make a good, the decision of what we keep and what we throw. So the data mining problem at the LHC is a complex one, because we need to make sure that what we are retaining is really what we want to study, and we are not throwing something that is potentially very interesting.
Right.
So how do we do this? We do this with a set of, if you like, of filters. We call them triggers.
Triggers, yeah.
Yeah, and these decisions happen basically online. So we have to be extremely fast in deciding what we keep and what we throw, because we produce huge amounts of data at the LHC. And in this decision, there are a lot of challenges, and technology has to help us in taking the right decisions. One of the projects that we have today in CERN Lab is with Micron as a partner, and is really looking at this area of work, where decisions have to be made very, very quickly online, and we don't have to get it wrong.
So in a sense, even as CERN and the Collider have advanced their own work and gone into new forms of scientific discovery and looking at new aspects of the universe, the IT infrastructure that you have has to evolve as fast as the science evolves, in effect.
Absolutely.
Right.
So not only we have an infrastructure that is actually, how can I say, interesting per se, because we have built in order to give the capability to the scientists all over the world to access data very, very quickly. We have built a distributed computing that today amounts to something like 1 million cores, hosts 1 exabyte of data, so we are already an exascale science. We also have to make sure that the infrastructure evolves with our computing needs. And computing needs at the LHC today are mastered by the current technologies, but the upgrade that is foreseen to take place in the next years at CERN will bring the data challenge even higher.
I mean, the upgrade of what the Collider is going to be delivering in terms of data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Collider will be upgraded to deliver more data so that we can do more precision studies. We can look also for signatures of events that we might not have yet seen. And at the same time, we need to make sure that this infrastructure evolves and allows us to do research and analyze these amounts of data that we will collect. We have collected until now, we will collect in the future. There will be even more data than now and more complex data.
So this architecture of having the data all right there by the computing processing capability, that is indispensable for the kind of work you're going to be doing.
It is indispensable, so the current one has to evolve. And how do we take advantage of the technologies that we have from industry today? And how do we exploit them so that our data mining problem becomes more efficient, becomes more effective, is a part of our challenge, is what we study today.
Before I go to Steve, I want to just ask you one thing, because in the video there was a kind of a brief mention of alternate dimensions, which for people like me, is one of the creepiest, weirdest things in physics. The idea that really there may be other realities beyond the one we're in. Do you think answering questions like that is the kind of thing that these new architectures are absolutely necessary to at least approach?
New architectures will help us to understand even better what we study at CERN. So in a way, will enable to answer those fundamental questions that we still don't know, like what is the real origin of dark matter, dark energy? Why is there an asymmetry between matter and antimatter in the universe?
Is that so? I didn't know that. Okay.
All these, well, we are here. All these fundamental questions, if you like, that we try to explain using the accelerators at CERN and studying fundamental physics, will be enabled and are being enabled by technology. We could not be doing the analysis of this data, we could not be processing this data if we wouldn't be helped by the technologies that we have today in computing, storage, memory, and networking.
Some of the discoveries I'm a little nervous about, but okay. So Steve, talk about any observations, but what does it mean to move the compute to the data, which is a phrase that I think you used with me on the phone?
Well, Sanjay said it best this morning. It's all about the energy and the speed of computation. To move a bit of data from one area to the other takes a significant majority of the energy that's used by a computing system
right.
today. And the time. I mean, there's a reason why Wall Street locates their data centers close to their traders. They can't afford the speed of light of going across the country to a data center and coming back with an answer. So proximity is very important, and you save energy in terms of doing that. And I've been associated in my career with CERN for about 11 or 12 years. When they were looking for the Higgs boson, the Higgs boson was the last particle to be predicted by the Standard Model, and they had a pretty good idea of what the decay was going to look like. So they used computers to simulate what that decay would be, and then when the collider, they shut the detector down, every year for a few months for maintenance. And so they would do the simulations then, and then they would look for that signature, and when they found it to 6 orders of standard deviation, they said, we have it. Now, they don't know what to expect and what they're looking for. And so when I joined Micron in 2014, and ran into Maria and her boss at Supercomputing, they were talking about the challenges they have of, since we don't know what to look for, we've got to filter bad data or data that isn't relevant and find those little pieces of information that are. It's a perfect problem for machine learning. You can train the networks if you've got enough data, and they've got the data, to be able to train the networks to what are events that look interesting and sift through the mountains of data in real time. And when you find those events that are interesting, we want to build a 3D representation of that, and that potentially could lead to new science, whether it's the discovery of dark matter or anything like that.
Give some examples of other areas of scientific and medical and other forms of research where this same approach is going to be increasingly necessary.
Well, it's interesting because it's a great question, by the way. I wonder if you wrote that down. And medical. So you're going to see some more work, and Sanjay had mentioned the work we were doing with Oregon Health Sciences University. It's basically the same network where we're taking a lot of 2D images and creating a 3D representation of those images. And in order to be able, and then the networks can kind of look at things that, either are artifacts of putting those images together, or they are actual representations that are really going to be, meaningful. Same type of network, different data, different training set, but, we can run it on the same level of hardware. Synthetic aperture radar. Right now it's used by the military of taking multiple 2D radar images and creating a 3D construct. It can be used for automotive as well, as you're trying to build a 3D representation of the information that's around you.
What about global warming remediation and figuring out what's really happening with the climate? Is that a good example of?
Well, as long as you have the data. And the interesting thing about machine learning that really excites me is the more data you get, the accuracy of your results get better. That's not necessarily true for classical computing. The more data you get, you tend to level off in terms of the accuracy of your results, but with machine learning. So as long as people have a lot of data, and one of the reasons that we went to CERN and said, hey, how about doing this? They've got the data where we can work with them, and they're building the networks, we can train the networks. And the insight they've given us just in our architecture today and what we can do to make it better has been phenomenal. And so I actually think we've gained a lot more from them right now, because we're actually building better, we're finding better solutions of an optimized memory and AI compute solution than we would just by using standard product.
One thing that has been said earlier today on the stage and that we hear a lot is that the 5G era is going to result in this vast explosion in the availability of data to analyze and monitor an extraordinary wide range of social and societal, every kind of phenomenon. In that sense, is what's happening in scientific research now kind of an early indicator of the way computing may need to move to deal with even more prosaic problems in the future as we have larger and larger data sets?
Yes, and I also believe that what that's going to force us to do is put more and more of that computing out at the edge, to where even the sensors themselves will have a significant amount of computing to basically sense, recognize, and deal with that data. And they're going to have to do it in a very stingy energy environment. And that's why, so understanding these architectures, we're really focusing on energy efficiency, compute capability, but energy efficiency of the compute storage subsystem, because that, we believe, will end up out at the edge into these different devices. When we talk about CERN, we're really at the edge. The stuff that they're going to would be deploying is going to be at the detector itself. So they want to do the filtering and get as much information before they send it across to the data center, because they'll be using more energy. They're sending 40 million, or was it 40 million collisions per second?
40 million a second, right?
At 4.6, so that's 4.6 terabytes per second. If they had to transfer that across a large network, that would be kilowatts of power a day that they would be wasting, that they could take care of, close to the edge.
And just one last thing, and then I want to ask Michael a couple of things, including about your work with Stephen Hawking. But you worked for Intel for many years before you came to Micron. So, you came out of the kind of processing part of the industry, and now you're in the memory part of the industry. What insights does that kind of give you, you think, uniquely from having those two pieces of your own career?
Well, you're right. I spent 32 years focusing on how we could make processing more efficient, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about the rest of the subsystem. We did when you couldn't build big enough caches or anything like that. Probably the epiphany I had was when Micron announced the Automata processor, which was a pattern recognition engine. And I was given a paper and asked, how is this going to affect our business? And but the interesting thing was it was people that took a memory architecture and they had a view of memory and how memory's built and applied it to a compute problem in a way that I would have never considered as a logic architect, doing things in the traditional fashion. We didn't continue with that because there's a huge software ecosystem and whatnot to build there. But what that did was, when you start thinking about neuromorphic architectures and really trying to mimic the brain, the memory architecture in terms of creating these large arrays where you can have multiple, tens of thousands of inputs and outputs like a human neuron has a huge opportunity for scale and uplift. So that's what brought me here, and then realizing the whole compute energy paradigm and how really memory, as somebody said earlier today, I think it was Mr. Molenkoff, leave the data where it's at, bring the computing to it, because that's going to be the most efficient solution.
So interesting. Yeah, the idea that moving memory just from storage into a processing space is in itself a hugely energy intensive activity. Right. That's something that, another insight that I hadn't had before doing this. So Michael, talk about some of the other scientific areas that you guys work with at HPE, and specifically, what have you done? Stephen Hawking, sadly, is no longer with us, but you worked with him and his group. What were you doing there?
So I'm one of the team that for the last 20 years has been helping deliver high-performance computer systems to Stephen Hawking's cosmology group at the University of Cambridge. And one of the things he would say is, we want to be scientists, not computer scientists. So they want computing tools that can help them test their theories out against the sensor data they've got, things like the background, the cosmic microwave radiation, background radiation, to look at the sort of test their theories of the origins of the universe. So they needed machines that are easy to use, easy to program. So the programmability is really key here to when you're testing theories, when you're trying to learn new data. So, we worked with that team for a long time, and actually they're part of the larger Dirac research community in the UK. That's both cosmologists and astrophysicists. And actually one of the interesting pieces of research recently that came out, and there's a paper in one of the recent Nature articles on this, was one of the exoplanets that's been discovered. They actually proved that there was water in the atmosphere of I think it's K2 18b is one of these exoplanets. And so, but to prove this theory, the computation they needed to do needed many terabytes of memory to sort of prove out their theory against the data of what they were observing. So it's having tools that can give you ease of use to test out theories, can really manage large amounts of data in one address space, into the tens of terabytes, and in the future will go to petabytes, exabytes within that same ease of use model.
Yeah, so you were talking about the thing where they found water on a planet in another solar system. Was that what
Correct,
it was?
yeah.
Which, I mean, and if you think about it, it's very similar to the problem Maria talks about of the 1,000 out of the 40 million. I mean, separating the signal from the noise. I remember reading about that and thinking, how the heck could they even figure that out? But you're saying this is part of the way. But it's not just putting the data and the compute together. It's coming up with new kinds of programming and ability to make new algorithms more rapidly because you have that architecture. Is that a fair way to summarize?
Yeah, we've been rethinking, and obviously general purpose computer systems started with for many decades now as CPU centric. CPU memory used to be pretty small and quite expensive, and so people developed algorithms assuming that was the case. We've now transformed the way we build technologies, and actually we can have large memories now, so you can rethink algorithms to make use of that resource. And so this is really enabling people to look in different ways and rethink how you build a system from the inside out. So having memory fabrics as essentially the underlying transport layer that processors can access data within. So I think there are new open standards in the industry around Gen Z or Compute Express Link that are really letting the memory semantics come outside of the processor domain and really open up a lot of innovation in memory technologies and how people go about scientific discovery.
Interesting. So Maria, is that an issue at CERN too, the idea of the speed with which new algorithms can be developed and tested? Is that something you guys think about?
Well, we are facing a resource gap problem because we work on flat budgets and our data will grow at a higher rate than the expected technology evolution. So,
or the budget, right? Yeah.
The budget.
The data grows faster than the budget.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Right.
So, how do we tackle this problem? We need, in a way, to change the way we are doing things today, so that we manage to close the resource gap. And we have a few angles. We can certainly make better use of the accelerator, so of the hardware that is at the market today, and we are doing this. We can also rethink of our algorithms so that they make use of machine learning, artificial intelligence technologies. And this is another big angle. So we have these two different, if you like, major R&D challenges ahead of us. And we hope that we will be there in a few years down the line, ready for taking data as required by the high luminosity LHC program.
So Steve, Maria just mentioned AI, which obviously comes up all day here for good reason. How does the kind of approach we're talking about relate to AI, and what would you say, particularly when we're talking about scientific and medical discovery going forward, how will the use of AI dovetail with this hardware architecture issue that we're discussing?
Well, most of when we talk, so AI is a broad concept. When we're talking about machine learning and using artificial neural nets, it's really a classification called convolutional neural networks. And those are just large matrix vector multiplications, or vector operations, which GPUs are very good at doing. And so what you're seeing are architectures that are more optimized to be able to do those types of computation in a much more efficient way. And so, but the problems that Maria is bringing to bear, so there are really two concepts, because you mentioned healthcare too. So in healthcare, the issue we've got is we need all the data all the data from the electron microscope in this particular case in the system itself, so we can stitch together the vision, the representation of the tumor. Now, the thing is that they need to do it in a day. Latency for them, a day would be fine, because the latency they're getting now is pretty extraordinary. Maria's problem, they need an answer in a microsecond, so they need something that can work really fast. And so what you're going to find is there may be different architectures in terms of that communication link between the memory storage subsystem and the AI hardware itself, where you can you can optimize for the different problems if there's an economical value to doing it. I'm assuming that we'll get to the point where CERN's problems will be problems that people can use, like in automotive and things like that, if you really want a great safety. What we want to do is there's really no reason why you can't take those multiply and accumulate architectures and get them closer and closer to memory, and eventually potentially in the substrate of the memory and storage system itself, because they are very simplistic structures. They're highly replicated, which is perfectly for a memory and storage array architecture. We're not there yet, but eventually we want to learn what we need to do so we can kind of sneak in eventually over time and get it to where then we can have an optimized architecture for the memory and storage and get the most energy efficient usage out of it.
Cool. Michael, what you mentioned, I know when we were prepping, a lot of medical work that you've done, where you were saying even for individual diagnosis, as we're getting to the point where the quantity of data about an individual patient is so vast because of particularly genomics, but probably going forward proteomics and other forms of data that's sort of cascading. In fact, at Techonomy right now, we're just doing an article for our next issue of our magazine about the wide variety of new forms of data about individuals that are coming into existence right now. So is this an equally apt place where this kind of new techniques will be required?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been doing work, one example was with a startup company looking at how you basically do molecular dynamic simulations, actually using GPUs of genetic mutations to see how different disease affects different people. And they were doing a lot of these simulations in the cloud using GPUs, but then the real challenge was how do they correlate all this data? And the infrastructure in the cloud is just not really set up to deal with when you have tens of terabytes of data to do correlations, and you want to do this quickly. So by working with them on a sort of a platform that's really optimized around memory-driven computing, we could ingest that data and then get speed ups in factors of hundreds of speed ups. So, and someone said, well, what does that mean? What does a speed up of 100 means? Well, it's sort of instead of if you go to your doctor and you want to understand what's going on, what pathway to go on for a particular disease, you'd much rather know tomorrow instead of in 9 months what the correct path to. So that's kind of the reality. The latency of these analysis really matters.
Yeah, I think we have to wrap fairly soon, but I'm taking away from this an insight. As a technology journalist myself for the last few decades, we've been so much obsessed with the consumer realm and particularly the internet, right? And the internet as a sort of platform for innovation. But really, I'm getting the feeling listening to this, and anyone has final thoughts on it, that because of even new kinds of hardware that we've sort of not talked about much at the sort of societal technology debate level, we are going to really start seeing some big advances in our understanding of ourselves, our environment, the universe, and maybe solving some key problems. Is that a fair summary? Anybody have any observations?
I completely agree with you. I
You
think
completely agree? I thought you might.
You know, I guess as a panel, we should, banter a little bit. I do have a Stephen Hawking story for you, by the way.
Too long to tell now, I assume?
No, actually, when he came and visited us, he said, we don't need bigger computers, we need bigger telescopes. And we were crushed because we were all about bigger computers.
But that might not be true anymore.
Yeah, it's not true anymore. No, I think the insights we're going to get are really phenomenal, but the insight I'm starting to gain is we can do a lot more of what we've traditionally been doing in classical computing on AI architectures. And so I'm actually more excited about, some of the signal processing things that we do in day-to-day lives that can be used, we can use these AI architectures to actually be bringing to bear there. And, I think the insight we'll get, for example, I'm of the belief that we could do a significant portion of the 5G front end, both to receive and transmit, in a neural network.
In a neural network.
In a neural network. And so those kinds of opportunities, I think, will open up a larger vista of capabilities that we can't even dream of today.
Wow. Any last thoughts you can't wait to say before we leave?
Actually, one point I'd definitely pick up that Steve mentioned earlier. The fact is most data is generated at the edge. We've got a huge edge device at CERN. We're going to have the square kilometer.
The hugest, yes.
Yeah, we're going to have a square kilometer array, which may be even more data. And so people need to realize that the amount of data at the edge is going to dwarf what can be put into centralized data centers. So we need, the exciting thing is now there is, a lot of innovation going on around hardware. We're just at the beginning of what can be done with AI, with sort of heterogeneous processing types, new advances. So I think, if you look back 5 years ago, the hardware world was getting kind of boring. People at Intel were designing great Xeon general purpose processors, and they were just completely dominating solving the problems at hand. But now it's really just huge opportunities for innovation going forward. And so as a hardware architect, I find it very exciting to see these opportunities.
And it's not just about the speed of processing anymore. It's about a whole new way of putting these pieces together, which is so interesting. Well, thank you to all three of you.